Welcome to our special premiere of the Diversity Project Part 1. I'm Kitty Kinnin. Today, we'll explore the racial divide in our city. Some of what you see here might surprise you. It may even shock you. Maybe you'll find some unexpected inspiration. Either way, thank you for stepping up and joining the conversation. Our show is about fostering a more harmonious, diverse, and unified city. Our mission is to create positive change. In order to do that, we have to take an honest look at the fallout and the lingering scars that are a part of Wilmington's history. We're going to hear from people who want to move forward, people who are stuck in the past, people who want to forgive and forget, and people who don't even see a racial divide. But remember, we can't move forward until we've examined the past with courage, objectivity, a willingness to learn, possibly even change our thinking. Slavery ended in the United States more than 140 years ago. Wilmington's 1898 massacre is now more than a century behind us. But many people in southeastern North Carolina, black and white, say that they can still see the evidence and feel the wounds that were inflicted during those terrible times in American history. For this show, we talk to people of all races and socioeconomic levels. We interviewed local citizens, people who'd been around here for generations, and others who have recently relocated. Although everyone agreed that racial equality was a good idea, no one agreed on where we really are now, or how far we have to go.
Well, I think there's an economic divide possibly, but not per se racial.
That ruling class in North Carolina, Wilmington, North Carolina, is still in power. If we look around us, if you know some of the old names and some of the old families that were responsible, you see that they're still in power here in Wilmington.
The state of New Hanover County School is being resegregated. In fact, some of them are resegregated at this time.
The high schools it's kind of noticeable there.
The normal racism that you would normally think of is white people don't like African American people, but it seems like it's really opposite around here.
I work in a business that the customers are predominantly black, and I don't see any difference in the way they are to me or the way I am to them.
I don't want to give the impression that this is a completely racist city, but the fact is there are still some reminders here, and there is a history here of a lot of pain and suffering among blacks.
I think Wilmington is a very racist city.
No, I would not categorize it as a racist city. I would categorize it as a very old, very proud Southern city.
Being in America, you can't help but be racist. The first manpower policy of America was slavery, and we haven't gotten out of that. And it's racism based on economics.
You can see it in the churches. You know, there are distinctively black churches, there are African American churches, and white churches, and it's becoming more integrated, though far more integrated than when I moved here 40 years ago.
But what people do agree on, in spite of the change in laws, the abolition of slavery, the banning of segregation by the Supreme Court, affirmative action, even stiffer penalties for crimes of hate, we still have a long way to go on the path to a truly integrated and peaceful community. You know, Wilmington is like a lot of other urban areas in the United States. It offers an initial impression of multiculturalism, even perhaps sophistication. But here's the thing, when you pierce that veneer, you discover a history that carries deep racial wounds into the present. Really, we're not trying to hammer in the problem as much as we are explore possible solutions and find those threads that might unify us. By solutions, we're talking about actions you can take, ways that you can contribute to making this one of the best possible places to live on the planet. During our research for this show, we encountered some people who question the need for rehashing history.
Well, the point is it happened. And that's just it. It happened. It's in the past. It's over 100 years ago.
One of my pet peeves is local history.
It's not a big deal anymore, at least not to the people that I know.
In other words, if I'm a tolerant person, if my family didn't own slaves, if I don't dislike people of other races, if I'm not angry about the past, are you telling me that I need to carry around guilt or anger? Bertha Todd recently lectured a group on the importance of creating the 1898 Memorial Foundation.
Listen, Wilmington is a fine place and a fine city, but it had a skeleton in the closet. And I said a wound occurred in Wilmington in 1898. Many were ashamed of it. It made many individuals frightened because of what happened. And are we going to stay in 1898 with that 1898 mentality? Are we going to grasp every bit of the faith and the courage that we have and get up and commemorate it and move forward?
Duke University professor Timothy Tyson.
None of us is responsible for something that happened in 1898 because none of us were alive. But we are responsible for the legacy of that, and what do we do now? We would all like to just have a fresh start and none of the mistakes that we've made be pertinent anymore. But we don't really get to do that. We wake up on Wednesday, and Wednesday has a whole lot of Tuesday in it, and Tuesday has a whole lot of Monday in it, because we don't really start over. We really deal with the world as it confronts us. And so we can't step outside history as deeply as we wish it was different. We can't step outside it and not deal with its consequences.
Before we talk about solutions, we need to understand how we got here. Most people are familiar with one of the central conflicts of the Civil War, the right to own slaves. Once the war was over, slaves were officially free men, but all over this country, they still faced crippling limitations when it came to integrating into white society. Less than half of African American society was registered to vote until the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1964. And without a voice in government, Black Americans were forced into an unspoken but clearly understood caste system. They were widely considered to be the very bottom of society by white America, and they were treated accordingly. Barred from white restaurants, schools, playgrounds, and parks, African American citizens were forced to stay on the outskirts of white society across the nation. Wilmington, however, was a much more politically progressive town. Not only did African Americans have a strong voice with the local newspaper, but almost half of the local government was African American. That level of diversity in American politics was almost unheard of in other parts of the country in the 19th century. In between classes at Duke University's Divinity School and the Center for Documentary Studies, Dr. Timothy Tyson teaches African American history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. But it wasn't his college career that introduced Tyson to the racist underbelly of North Carolina.
When I was 10 years old, a boy that I played with every day walked up in my driveway and said, "Daddy and Roger shot him." And he was telling me in those words that his father and his brothers had killed this young black man, Henry Mara.
It was a pivotal moment in Tim's life. And years later, after researching North Carolina politics and writing the recent bestseller, Blood Done Sign My Name, Dr. Tyson now dismisses the widely held notion that North Carolina has been a historically conservative state.
We tend to go back and forth between our hopes and our fears. We either turn to each other, or we turn on each other.
In the book, Tyson points out that the predominant textbook view of the civil rights struggle as a peaceful, nonviolent movement is basically flawed.
We're not a very nonviolent country, and people didn't agree on that. The police in places like Birmingham and Wilmington, for that matter, would complain about those nonviolent rocks and bottles that were getting thrown at them, and that's because not everybody was under nonviolent discipline. Not everybody believed in nonviolence.
But according to Tyson, it was the murder of Henry Mara in his hometown of Oxford, North Carolina, that caused the seed of activism to germinate within him.
I remember going down the street and seeing armed men all over the front porch of my friend's house. I remember walking to school the next day and there not being a plate glass window left in downtown Oxford. We'd had a riot in the night, and we had a murder trial that summer in which my friend's father and brothers were acquitted of murder, though they had committed this killing in front of a lot of people, and I knew that they had done it.
Henry Merrow was a black veteran of the Vietnam War and was murdered by a white Oxford store owner for allegedly flirting with a white woman. The almost cavalier attitude of the public and the judicial system towards his lynching and ultimately agonizing murder is what propelled Tyson into the ministry and ultimately into a search for the causes behind such hate. I want to talk about that, growing up in a household who really sort of supported civil rights and again seemed to be very liberal minded. But there's subtleties, and like you say, you learn imperfections about people. And I think that looking back after you wrote the book, there was an event when you were 10 years old at the water fountain, which gave a lot of pause to that particular subject for you.
I'll just read you the passage. I hadn't noticed the black boy in the line, and suddenly there he was in front of me, bent over the old iron spout. Deep down, I did not want to drink after him, without really understanding why, and even though I knew better. Somewhere inside, I had accepted white supremacy. The world had kennelled a vicious lie in my brain. At the core of the lie, crucial silence, since there was no why. Black was filthy, black was bad. I had somehow managed to learn. Many of my white classmates turned away from the fountain rather than drink after a black child. And even at that moment, because I had been taught to know better, I knew that my revulsion was a lie, someone else's lie, and an evil thing. This time I decided not to give the lie the power it demanded. I could not turn away. I lowered my head and drank after him, but I succumbed slightly. When he moved, I took my turn, but let the water run for a few seconds before I drank, pausing to let the water rinse the spout. I guess that made me a moderate.
Tyson's willingness to see the lie for what it was, even though it had already embedded itself in his consciousness, is the same honesty that allowed him to uncover what might be the most dangerous form of racism.
I came to understand that, white supremacy is like the water and we are like the fish. And fish don't know much about water, and fish have a hard time discussing water. The wetness of water is something that they take for granted.
Dr. Len Leachy is a clinical psychologist at UNCW who has studied racial bias.
An implicit bias basically is a bias that most people are not aware of that's occurring. They have this, but they don't know that they have this bias, and it nevertheless affects their behavior, and it affects it so much so that important outcomes are going to be affected, things like important decisions, behaviors that they engage in. A more typical way this manifests, though, for implicit bias is individuals on the surface will say, I just want the best candidate to be hired. I'm going to fairly evaluate these. And they begin looking through them. And what they do, though, is they engage in a very subtle biasing against the minority group.
Dr. Leachy told us about a recent study conducted in 2000 in which researchers gave people job applications to sift through and find the best candidate. And each application had the person's picture attached, revealing their race.
And they had 3 conditions in terms of the quality of the application, either very strong, clearly unqualified, or something that was kind of ambiguous in the middle and could go either way. And what they found was in the clear cases where the person was either clearly qualified or not qualified, bias was actually relatively weak in those instances.
But what happens when all things seem equal? The candidates are not strongly qualified, but they can't be ruled out either. Is there a racial group that wins the job consistently?
But in the cases where you had ambiguous information, so a person who could kind of go either way, there was a huge advantage to the white applicants.
And Dr. Leachy points out what's sometimes difficult for us to believe. We carry around these prejudices, and very often we don't even know we have them.
If we really could test them in day-to-day reaction, we realize, wow, they're still there.
Dr. James Johnson of UNCW pioneered a groundbreaking study of black bias toward whites. And while he acknowledges that mistrust and hanging on to the scars of history can be destructive, even to someone's physical health, He says many African Americans who move here from other cities tell him that they're surprised by the overt racism they see here. It's a small community. There are constant reminders. I'm sure that has to affect how African Americans feel.
Sure, and people always sort of say, well, tell black people just sort of get over it. It's in the past, it's done. But as you say, there are constant reminders of that part of our history. There are constant reminders of the pain and suffering that blacks endured from whites. I mean, you have the Hugh McCray Park, you have these street names, and so it's very difficult to sort of get past it when you have these constant reminders of the painful past.
Wilmington, so you feel, is maybe more of a segregated town?
I just think it's still a very segregated town. And again, I've been here for many years, and I think I've maybe seen one black waiter in this town, but I've seen a lot of black kitchen staff. Mm-hmm. Okay, I've seen a lot of black bus boys and black cooks and black dishwashers. And again, what that does is sort of validate this idea that in Wilmington, blacks are second-class citizens. Riverfest, and again, I'm not from here, but just recently I heard some stories about the perceptions that some blacks have of Riverfest. And again, I have no idea whether or not this is true, but I think what's interesting is that these perceptions are there. The perception that Riverfest is a celebration of the slave trade, and they supposedly, someone told me that they brought the slaves in to the river, downtown by the river, and Riverfest is some sort of celebration of selling of slaves. And I heard this from a number of individuals.
That's so hard to imagine.
Well, what happens is it becomes believable if you think about the riots in the Wilmington 10. Then it becomes believable because there's such a history in this town of bias and racism towards blacks and black suffering that it wouldn't be, for a lot of blacks, it wouldn't be a great leap to assume that the Riverfest is a celebration of slavery.
But ask Bertha Todd, an African-American woman who spent her career in the New Hanover County school system and received multiple awards for her work. Ask Ms. Todd about whether she believes it's a continuing insult to have a local park named after one of the instigators of the 1898 massacre. And she gets almost angry at the question, fed up with the refusal to move forward.
I disagree with that. I disagree with that because one of the descendants, whom the park is named after, made that public apology again. Although Star News and no media were there to hear the apology, I simply say that that is a legacy for that family. The red shirts did the killings, and since there was a public apology regarding that, let it remain. I'm not saying there wasn't harm done. All I'm saying is those individuals who know their families, individuals who can simply hire their attorneys or whatnot, if they want to pursue it, I'll say like John Hope Franklin, let them pursue it.
We soon found that everyone had an opinion on whether the park should keep its name.
I wouldn't go there if I had to.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I don't go there. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
I think it's deplorable, but this city would still fund a park named after the man who tried to destroy this city.
I know Hugh McCray personally, and we go to my church, and I don't have any problem with Hugh McCray, or Hugh McCray Jr., who's a few years older than I am. I mean, it's just named after his grandfather, and he is what he is, and it is what it is, and it's water under the bridge.
I think it should be changed. Yeah, because Hugh McCray was one of the major players in the coup d'etat and the destruction of Wilmington during that time.
I don't think the name should change. I mean, the people I happen to know, the current Hugh McCray, and he's a fine man. I mean, and I think that happened. It's named for that individual, and I don't think that the continuation of the name should have any impact on the future of the black community, or this is Wilmington in general.
Dr. Johnson emphasizes that changing the name of streets or a park isn't just about wiping the slate clean for blacks. It's about demonstrating to the African American community that white people care, and more importantly, can be trusted.
It's been proven over and over. African Americans have always been a recipient people, so it makes it very difficult for them to be able to trust any white person.
But Bertha Todd talks about a time when one of her African American students voiced his mistrust of whites. And she asked him to simply take a leap of faith.
And finally he looked at me in exasperation and said, "Well, Mrs. Todd, I've never found a white that I could trust." My heart simply sank. I said, "Well, you trust me, and I've found some whites that I can trust. So take my word for it."
Why does Bertha Todd have such a different view? How can she afford to be so open and trusting?
I did not have what I consider the 1898 mentality. I consider the 1898 mentality as a residual, a carryover from what occurred in 1898. It was among the whites, and it's among the African Americans, although it's a different sort of feeling.
If you haven't heard about the events of 1898, you're not alone. We found that when people hear the actual details of this event, they're stunned that such a thing could even happen in the United States. So we thought we'd let some locals share the details of the 1898 race riots.
I don't know, and I don't believe I've even really read anything about it. 1998.
1898.
1898. No, not at all. I don't know anything about it.
No, I do not know what happened here in 1898.
In Wilmington?
In Wilmington.
No. Not really. I'm from Selma, Alabama, actually, where there was a lot of civil rights stuff, but I don't really know a lot about Wilmington.
Probably slavery.
Well, I'm trying to figure out a nice way of saying this. How would you phrase this? I gotta be PC here. Basically, I mean, there were quite several people. I'm trying to remember exactly how it is. Several people were hung.
It's interesting that it's the only town, I think, that has ever been taken over, where the government's been taken over for like 20 seconds or something. It's an interesting piece of trivia. I don't know how much impact it still has today.
The whole idea was to intimidate the black population and scare them. And as an end result, quite a few of them left. As a matter of fact, a major percentage of the black population of Wilmington hauled out of here and left. If memory serves me correct, probably well over half of it.
They overthrew a legal government, which was the only legal government in the country that has ever been overthrown. What they created a coup d'etat.
First of all, I don't remember a race riot happening in Wilmington. I remember there being, I know of there being the first and only coup d'etat in America taking place in Wilmington. Race was used as the catalyst to get it started.
Coincidentally, we ran across a man who wrote his thesis on this very subject.
The Fusion Party, it started, which was predominantly black, and then also there were white populists who had joined forces and throughout the state, and in Wilmington they were elected to many prominent positions in Wilmington, and were doing a very good job managing the city and just generally making strides towards general improvements in the city's infrastructure.
That's right. And it's an important point. In 1897, Wilmington was truly one of the most progressive, diverse, unified governments in the country. The Fusion Party was made up of blacks and whites who believed that women should have the right to vote. They also pushed the idea of creating public schools, free education for all American children. That was a radical idea at the time. Now, that's how most American children are educated. But there was another group strongly opposed to that movement.
There were white citizens, prominent citizens, who didn't like that, didn't like it one bit, and they formed two conspiratorial groups and to overthrow these elected officials. And they did, pretty much. In November of 1898, they forced these officials to resign, and many of them were forced out of town, basically by gunpoint, and the rest is history, as they say. I mean, that was a coup d'etat, the first and only coup d'etat in the history of this country, as far as I know.
Remember what Dr. Tyson points out. North Carolinians, especially Wilmingtonians, have a lot to be proud of. Perhaps we had the only coup d'etat in American history, but we voted our extremes. The 1898 Commission was established to develop a historical record of the event and to determine the extent of the impact on the African American community in Wilmington.
It did have a traumatic impact on the, shall we say, the psyche of the black community.
And what are you going to do? You're going to look back and stay in 1898, or you're going to move forward and try to do something about it.
So we wanted to find real human examples of people who transcend the divide, people who sit as beacons, stirring examples that can inspire us, encourage us, and most importantly, begin to change our minds. Meet Addie Bonsignor. Addie has lived through her share of personal tragedies, including watching her house burn down. She's also lived through the civil rights struggles of the 60s. She's even been told to go to the back of the bus. But listen to the way she tells her story.
This particular time that I got on the bus, me and my sisters, and the guy tried to get us to go, and he wouldn't take the bus on until we moved in the back, but we decided we were going to stay in the front. So this other guy says, well, why don't you sit down and go ahead and drive, man? And so we sat there. And, but we never thought anything about that. We never held anything in our hearts about hating other people because of this.
Addie says it was her father who taught her that every human is equal.
Dad always told us, there's nobody better than you. We didn't hold grudges in our hearts.
So what about the past? How do we think about it? Well, you can understand how, and I'm sure you've seen, people have resentment. And it's difficult in a home because really it's the parents who teach that history and the racial past and also, the crimes of the past. Right. So are they really just trying to protect their children and the future generations?
I really don't think so. I think it's what's on the inside, and some of them have bitter roots, and they just want this thing to just keep filtering down from generation to generation. I think it's a bad thing because we have to love one another. We have to get along with each other. We work together. And I just wished today that people would come together and be on a oneness because it's time,
Besides working towards understanding in New Hanover County schools, Bertha Todd helped establish the YWCA and in the process forged a deep friendship with Betty Cameron from one of Wilmington's most prominent families. The two might never have crossed paths without the shared mission of creating the YWCA.
We held those dialogues for approximately 2 years, sometimes twice a week, sometimes once a week. And we felt so good about having learned more about each other and the so-called different cultures. But we also learned that the commonalities outweighed the differences.
These ladies called themselves the Liberal Ladies Who Lunch. They worked toward eliminating racism. They felt passionately it was up to them to create positive change. Another beacon, New Hanover County District Attorney Ben David visits schools all across Pender and New Hanover County, driving home the message to kids. They have choices. He hopes especially to reach those children at risk, planting at least a seed. It's overwhelming to think this is where kids end up when they can't be reached. The damage is done, and often they spend their whole lives through these revolving doors here.
It's a terrible place to be. And the problem is, after they've been arrested and have a right to remain silent, it's too late to have a conversation with them about their future.
Let's talk about the disproportionate number of blacks compared to whites that are behind these doors, these cell doors.
There are more young, especially African American men in the system than any other group, and that is of great concern to those of us in the criminal justice system. Much of the violence that I see is intraracial. It's black on black, for instance. And I can't help you. I can't give you a voice if you're remaining silent. I need you to come forward to be a witness. If you're a victim, you need to say it, and we're going to help you. We need to focus not just on the disproportionate number of minorities who are defendants, but the disproportionate number of minorities who are victims.
And do the punishments match the crimes? Is that another subtle form of racism in our society? According to data from the Justice Department, the racial divide even reaches into the legal system. Blacks are receiving much harsher penalties, prison sentences, for much longer than whites. That's what we see. They spell it out to us. So obviously, you know, we have to wonder about that.
And the same statistics would also show you that far more men serve longer time in prison. It doesn't mean that the system is sexist. We have to look at causation and correlation. We have to see who's committing crimes and who's getting punished for those crimes to have an honest look at whether race plays a role in either prosecution or in punishment. There's many safeguards in place to try and root out racism. For instance, you can't select a jury based on race. If you do, it's a mistrial. If you ask me whether racism exists in this system, I'll tell you that anytime there's two or more races in anything, you always have the potential for it.
What do you see out there? Do you see people who are biased and not really, you know, aware of it?
I see people doing the very best they can to enforce the laws. I think what we have to look at is there a subtlety in this? Are there people through jury verdicts that are deciding cases based on race, either to nullify it or find someone guilty? Are there people with discretion in the system, either officers on the street, prosecutors in the courtroom, or judges that have a limited amount of discretion after structured sentencing, who are going to factor race in?
It's a matter of building trust as well, and I know that has to be so difficult.
Here's the brutal truth in the criminal justice system. The vast majority of people who are victims of violent crime or who are victims of drug dealers hanging out in their community are African American. We're talking about the highest victim areas in this community are African Americans. And the people who are charged with trying to protect them and trying to prosecute cases on their behalf, for the most part, tend to be white. Not exclusively, but tend to be from a different racial class. And if that's the case, then the only way we're going to effectively do our job is if we build that bridge of trust and heal the divide that's there right now, that's been born out of years of distrust in this community.
Now, we promised that this show would be about solutions. Is a memorial to the victims of 1898 enough? Well, it validates the wounds, and yes, it acknowledges that this terrible story is in fact true. In some circles, though, it carries a dubious designation of urban legend. Some people even push the idea that there are only threads of truth to this story. But the fact that a band of white vigilantes burned down a black printing press and ran the entire black power structure out of town is no longer in dispute. What is still a question? How to repair the damage. Here's what some attendees at the recent NAACP convention had to say about healing.
Talk about the things that are important to our community. Ensure that justice is done within our community. We all love Wilmington. Wilmington is a great place, and we want to see it prosper. We want to see it be a great place to live.
Associate more with each other and to learn the cultures and what of each other. We should start at the very young age to make sure that we have diversity and everybody understands each other.
To create unity, we need to first identify our commonality and stop focusing on what's different.
Treat your brother or sister the same way you want to be treated, whether that's in the workplace, or in the community, or whatever. If you treat your brother or sister the same way you want to be treated, I can assure you we'll get beyond these issues.
We came together as a nation after 9/11. People wasn't talking about being black, we wasn't talking about being white, we wasn't talking about being Hispanic, we were talking about being Americans. And so we have to create that dialogue and build relationships with people that don't look like us.
I guess it can go back as simple as the golden rule: treat others how you want to be treated.
And what about those beacons of unity we referred to earlier? Remember Addie Bonsignor?
There's a story in the Bible, Lot and his wife, when God spoke to them and told them to leave out of Sodom and Gomorrah and told them not to look back. And Lot's wife, she had to look back one more time. And when she did, she turned to a pillar of salt. And it's time to teach our children the way of life, a good life. And the good life is ahead of them.
And Bertha Todd.
I would see African Americans, whites, Hispanics, all people willing to respect the cultures of each other. We live in a diverse area. I see each one of the ethnic groups willing to help each other, willing to stoop down and help a child regardless of the hue of the skin, willing to speak out for fairness and justice for all, willing to stand up and say, we are all of God's children, made in the image of God. So let us help God's children move forward.
Dr. Tyson.
Trying to help people have experiences that cross lines of color and class and community, and let people have those kinds of experiences with each other and see how much they have in common.
And here's what many of you told us.
Who can I benefit the most with my time? And that would be the children. And the time that one can spend with the children now is the time that will make a difference in the future.
One of the things I like about Wilmington is it's still virgin territory, and if you have anything in you, you can bring it out here in Wilmington. The idea is to get us to work together as a group of people, black and white, working together and trying to just show people, visitors to this town, that we can be a loving people.
You treat everybody with mutual respect. I try to treat everybody fairly and with respect, regardless of their skin tone or color.
You sit down and talk with one another, get to know one another. It's still a very small town. I know half of the town, I think. It's because I purposed to get to know my neighbor. And I think that if we purpose to get to know one another, it's really easy. There are black people out here dying for you to come and say hello to them, you know?
Well, I mean, treat everyone with respect and respect who they are, what they believe.
Color doesn't mean anything. Color shouldn't, everybody's the same color on the inside.
Just try to get along with everybody. We bleed the same blood, we wear the same clothes, we listen to the same music nowadays. So, just try to get along with everyone.
That's the way it is. You got to look forward. You forgive, you forget, you move on. You turn the other cheek.
People need to have more experience with one another, with different kinds of people, and they need to learn to be comfortable being uncomfortable.
One group continuing the dialogue call themselves the Big Picture Talkers. It's a group of people from all walks of life who, among other things, are committed to creating a peaceful, multicultural community.
We are committed to bringing together a new multicultural community
in order to create a space
and the time to dissect,
discuss,
and confront
Wilmington's racial history. Furthermore, we will attempt to understand history's persistence
and determine the face of our future.
When you look to the future in Wilmington and around us in general, what do you see, Miss Addie?
Well, I see really a move of God. I see God going to bring people together He's going to bring his people together if enough people will stand up and say to them, you know, it's all choice. Today is choice. We can do anything that we want to do. And if you have Christ Jesus, he says, you know, we can do all things through Christ Jesus who strengthens us.
This brings the conversation back to you. We've heard a wide variety of perceptions today, from highly biased people to those who are willing to accept each person and each day on their own terms, forgiving the past and forgetting old wounds. We can't tell you how to bridge the gap in this community. We can offer ideas. The racial divide in Wilmington, the reasons behind it, the ways to transcend that gap are each in themselves complex enough to fill hours of television. But we hope that this will serve as a beginning of an honest and ongoing conversation. In the meantime, remember Margaret Mead's admonition: never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed people can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has.